You thought war was glory? Think again. The first thing you feel is the heat, not from the sun, but from the crowd around you, tacked shoulder to shoulder, eyes locked on the man shouting from the church steps. His voice isn't preaching, it's commanding, promising you a ticket to heaven if you march to war. You picture glory, shining armor, songs sung in your name. But days later, you're wearing rusted chain mail that rubs your neck raw, boots soaked in mud, and carrying a biscuit so hard it could break teeth. The men beside you, farmers with pitchforks, drunks with stolen swords, and Gerald, who fights with a frying pan. By the first battle, you realize the truth. War is screaming, smoke, chaos, and survival is the only victory that matters. That the Crusaders are just the start. Around the world, in different ages, other warriors fought their own brutal battles. Samurai with blades as sharp as their honor. Mongols who could hit you with an arrow while riding away at full gallop. Zulu impi charging in a deadly horns of the buffalo formation. Gurkhas whose curved kukuri knife carried the promise, better to die than be a coward. This is the side of history you were never taught, raw, unfiltered, unforgettable. So hit like, smash subscribe, and let's march together into the mud, the blood, and the glory of history's most legendary warriors. The first thing you remember is the voice, loud, rhythmic, and rising like a storm. A sermon, though calling it that feels too polite for what it was. This was no soft Sunday homily. This was fire and iron from the mouth of a man in robes, his eyes wild with purpose. He spoke of sin and salvation, of enemies lurking in the east, and of Jerusalem, the city of God, being every Christian's responsibility. You weren't entirely sure where Jerusalem was, somewhere beyond France, south of the pig farm, east of everything you ever known. Still, you nodded along with the crowd. Then came the promise, from the Pope himself, that anyone who joined the crusade would be granted a complete forgiveness of sins, every last one. That was tempting. Especially after that business last spring behind the mill house, the one you'd been hoping God had missed. Apparently, he keeps receipts. And truthfully, you were bored. 14 years plowing the same field, eating the same barley and onions, living in the same damp hut with a roof that whistled in the wine. It was enough to make anyone dream of something grander. When a neighbor whispered the words eternal glory, you couldn't help but picture yourself in shining armor, returning home to applause, gold, and your name sung by minstrels. That image was enough to drown out your mother's voice asking whether God would also be providing the bread for the trip. So you volunteered, or rather, you were nudged into it during a night at the tavern, after 3 mugs of weak ale and a swelling sense of invincibility. You woke the next morning clutching a wooden cross, someone else's boots, and the uneasy knowledge that you had sworn an oath to march thousands of miles. Your preparations were swift and pitiful. The army offered no training, no map, and certainly no actual armor unless you could pay for it, and you could not, the grand knightly gear you imagined. Instead, a neighbor handed you a chainmail shirt that smelled like a blacksmith's armpit and looked like it had lost a fight with a river. It wasn't a bit heavy. It was as though a small anvil had decided to wrap itself around your torso. The helmet was worse, conical, dented, and designed with the kind of cruelty only a man who hates necks could devise. No padding, just bare metal, so that every step rattled your skull like a cooking pot over a fire. For your legs, wool wrappings. No greaves, no leather reinforcement, just wool, like a half-hearted present wrapped by someone who dislikes you. Footwear, worn-out turn shoes, their soft leather hardly enough to keep out mud, let alone a battlefield. By the first mile you'd earned a blister so angry it felt like it was plotting rebellion. And the surcoat, the bright tunic worn over armor to show your allegiance, was once white, now an uninspiring beige, with a crude red cross brushed on by a man who also happened to sharpen pig's tusks on the side. Around you, the army assembled in every shade of absurdity. A few knights gleamed in proper mail. Others looked like they'd ransacked a kitchen instead of an armory. Your neighbor Gerald showed up shirtless, armed with a wooden shield he'd carved himself. In wobbly Latin, it read, "Jesus, watch this." There was no uniform discipline, just a mass of men, bows, and the occasional woman, armed with everything from dull swords to pitchforks and broom handles. But you told yourself you were now knighting God's service. The truth, you looked more like a frightened turnip wrapped in ire. The trumpets, or possibly just a man shouting, signaled the start of the march. This wasn't the gallant cavalry charge of the Psalms. It was a shuffling, groaning tide of humanity, dragging carts and goats, herding children, and stepping around a man who insisted on hauling a piano. Everyone was armed, though only a fraction with actual weapons. One man marched with a hammer tied to a stick, proudly calling it God's toothpick. Within minutes, the chain mail had begun to saw at your neck, the boots to steer your feet, and the pack, containing 2 onions and a hard biscuit, to feel like a sack of rocks. Someone coughed behind you, and you briefly considered turning back. And then came the no's, the endless no's. Conversations in half a dozen languages, prayers muttered through cracked lips, arguments over where to walk, a child crying for his mother, a goat bleating in protest. Occasionally, a mounted noble would ride past, shout something like "Forward, men," and promptly vanish for the rest of the day. The first afternoon's heat soaked through wool and iron alike. You sweated in places you didn't know could sweat, your thighs chafing like parchment rubbed raw. By the time the rain arrived, sudden, cold, and relentless, you were too miserable to even curse. The road dissolved into mud, your surcoat plastered itself to your chest, and your legs sank into each step as though the earth itself was trying to keep you from going further. That night you lay down in wet grass beside a stranger whose snoring could have been used in siege warfare. You closed your eyes and tried to imagine Jerusalem's golden streets, only to dream of your mother's onion soup instead. It was only the first day. By day 4, hunger had ceased to be an inconvenience and become an all-consuming presence. A knowing voice in your stomach that sang hymns in the key of desperation. The sermons before departure had painted an image of abundance, bread, wine, meat provided by God's grace and the Pope's blessing. In reality, the army's supplies were either moldy, missing, or locked away in a tent of Brother Ulrich, who claimed to be fasting for spiritual purity while suspiciously chewing in the dark. Breakfast, if it came at all, was a lump of black bread dense enough to dent armor. You chewed until your jaw ached and the bread refused to yield, eventually gnawing out of habit rather than hope. One companion swore his loaf contained a nail. Nobody doubted him. Lunch was a fiction, a memory from another life. You made do with a few dried peas that tasted like despair and centuries-old dust. Every so often, someone produced something special. A man offered you a salted fish he'd been keeping in his sock. You declined politely, though the thought of actual flavor almost overrode the smell. Hunger has a way of bending your standards until they snap. The problem wasn't just scarcity, it was logistics. The supply lines stretched across hostile lands, poorly guarded and often raided by locals who had no interest in surrendering their winter stores to a ragtag holy army that left foraging, which was a gamble. You found a bush heavy with berries. Gerald insisted they were fine. You remembered Gerald had once eaten a candle and believed it to be cheese. The berries were not fine. You spent 2 hours behind a tree, questioning your life choices. Dinner was stew, always stew. The contents were a mystery. Stringy meat that could be rabbit, could be boot leather. You learned not to ask. The heat of it was enough to fool you into thinking you were nourished, but you woke in the night with your stomach grumbling like distant thunder. And then came the smell, not the stew. That had its own grim charm, but the collective aroma of thousands of unwashed bodies trudging through mud. By the end of the first week, the entire crusading force carried what might generously be called a shared scent, the kind of musk that could strip paint from a chapel door. There was no soap unless you counted chunks of tallow carved into lumps and passed off as such. Bathing was rare, reserved for the wealthy or the reckless. Water was too precious to waste on scrubbing when it could be poured into a cup or onto a wound. Clothes clung damp to your skin, stiff with sweat and dirt. Your boots, perpetually wet, began to feel alive in ways you didn't want to investigate. And the lice, God's smallest and most relentless soldiers. They moved in on the first day and refused to leave. Some men named them. Others waged nightly wars with fingernails and curses. You itched in rhythm with the march. Scratch, shuffle, groan. A chorus echoed by the entire column. The latrines didn't exist. You went where you could. Behind a bush, beside a wagon, or, when privacy finally surrendered, within sight of strangers who politely pretended not to notice. Soon, modesty was as foreign as fresh bread. Illness arrived quietly, carried in coughs and sneezes that spread faster than any rumor. One man vomited behind a cart. By evening, half his companions were pale and sweating. Medieval medicine offered 3 options: prayer, bleeding, or being told to walk it off. None of them worked. The healers, more hopeful than skilled, waved bundles of herbs over the sick, muttered incantations, or applied leeches to balance the humors. Fevers burned, throats swelled, stomachs revolted. The unlucky ones were cured with hot irons pressed to the skin, after which they either recovered or didn't. And the water, the supposed cure for all ailments, was no better. Streams ran cloudy, sometimes with the pleasant bonus of a dead animal upstream. You drank anyway. Thirst had no standards. The priests said it was a test from God. The more practical among you muttered it was simply the cost of marching with thousands of people who had never heard of washing their hands. By the second week, everyone was sick, or recovering from sickness, or preparing to be sick again. You learned to walk with your mouth closed, to breathe shallowly when near the hacking cough of a fellow traveler, and to pray not for victory, but for a few hours without stomach cramps. By the second week, everyone was sick, or recovering from sickness, or preparing to be sick again. You learned to walk with your mouth closed, to breathe shallowly when near the hacking cough of a fellow traveler, and to pray not for victory, but for a few hours without stomach cramps. And still, you hadn't even glimpsed the enemy. The real war, you began to think, wasn't in Jerusalem at all. It was here, in the mud, against hunger, filth, and the treachery of your own body. If you thought the enemy would be waiting patiently on some distant field, you were wrong. Long before you reached anything resembling a front line, you discovered that the road itself was hostile, not from soldiers, but from the very people whose villages you passed through. The locals didn't cheer when they saw the crusading cross on your surco. They tightened their gates and hid their animals. They knew your kind, an unpredictable tide of strangers who trampled crops, demanded food you couldn't pay for, and sang war hymns long after the sun had set. You were not a holy army to them, you were trouble with a marching beat. In one town, the bishop stood on the walls and made the sign of the cross at you as though warding off a curse. A monk offered a single cabbage on the condition you left immediately. In another village, you attempted to ask for water and somehow, through a mangled string of Latin and gestures, accidentally demanded someone's wife. That negotiation ended with a bucket of slop thrown at your head. If you did manage to buy supplies, you paid in humiliation. Bread that crumbled like old plaster, ale that tasted of varnish, meat so questionable it might have been out walking the day before. Directions to Jerusalem were always generous, rarely accurate. More than once you were sent down a road that led only to the next hamlet, where the inhabitants were equally unwelcoming. The further east you marched, the less certain anyone seemed about where east actually was. Your commander waved a hand-drawn map with 3 rivers, to towns, and what appeared to be a dragon sketched in the margin. Some insisted Jerusalem was just past Constantinople, though none could point to where that was. You crossed the same stream 3 times in a single day, and a monk swore it was a different stream each time because this one was holier. Every now and then, a local guide was hired, a man given a skin of wine, a handful of coins, and a promise not to be trampled. He would lead you confidently for half a day, then vanish before breakfast, leaving the entire army standing in a field debating which direction smelled more like salvation. Gerald claimed he was following divine whispers on the wind. The wind, unfortunately, seemed to say only, "You're lost." And then, after weeks of this wandering, came the first real battle. It didn't begin with the dramatic blare of horns or a gallant charge. It began with screaming, not just from the enemy, not just from your side, but from everyone, yourself included. You'd imagined strategy, formations, coordinated strikes, the poetry of disciplined warfare. What you got was chaos wrapped in dust and nose. Your helmet blocked half your vision. Your sword felt heavier than it ever had in training, not that you'd really had training. You reached for your shield only to remember that Gerald had borrowed it that morning to cook bacon. Arrows flew before anyone was ready. The front line surged forward while the back line surged backward. A man was trampled by his own horse. Another swung a frying pan like a war hammer. Someone stabbed himself in the foot and blamed the devil. And for once you thought he might be right. You charged because everyone else did. Social pressure is a powerful thing when the alternative is being the only one left standing still. You swung at shadows, at armor, at anything that moved. Once, you hit a helmet, your own, bouncing off someone's shield as you stumbled. The enemy was faster, sharper, younger than you expected. You locked eyes with one bow, no older than 15, and saw in him something terrifying: competence. For a moment, you considered throwing down your weapon and pretending to be dead. The air filled with shouts in half a dozen languages, orders contradicting each other, and the occasional tavern song shouted by someone who'd clearly mistaken the battle for a festival. It was impossible to tell who was winning, or if winning was even an option. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The survivors dragged themselves away from the field, limping, bleeding, coughing. You found yourself with a shallow cut on your ankle and no memory of how it happened. Gerald now wore your helmet as a soup bowl. Was it glorious? No, but you were alive. And in this war, that already counted as a kind of victory. If hunger and disease were enemies you could grudgingly endure, the weather was a commander that delighted in breaking you. One morning, the sun rose like a molten coin, and by midday your chain mail felt like you were being slow roasted in a blacksmith's oven. Sweat slid down your back in rivulets, pooling beneath your wool and leather. Your tongue turned dry as parchment, and even the air seemed to shimmer with heat. Beside you, a knight swore he saw a tavern in the distance. You saw it too. Whitewashed walls, a shaded courtyard, a pitcher of cool wine, and then it vanished into the haze. Just when you thought you'd be roasted alive, the sky shifted. Clouds gathered, dark and swollen, until the heavens cracked open. Not a drizzle. This was rain that felt personal, as though the sky had been waiting for the exact moment your spirits lifted to strike them down. It soaked your surco until it clung like a shroud. Your boots filled with water and squelched at every step, making you sound like a penitent duck. The road dissolved into mud so deep it could claim a shoe without a trace. You slipped, Gerald slipped, and at one point he fell face first into a steaming cow patty. You didn't laugh, at least not out loud, but your soul chuckled quietly. And when night fell, the temperature plunged. One moment you were bowling, the next you were shaking so hard your teeth rattled. The desert and the mountains each had their way of punishing the arrogant, and you were traveling through both. It was during these extremes that the cracks in the Holy Alliance began to show. You'd been told this was a united Christian army, warriors of the cross marching together against the infidel. The reality was an uneasy knot of factions barely tolerating each other. First, the Byzantines. You expected brothers in arms, you found gatekeepers. They spoke Greek, crossed themselves differently, and regarded you with the suspicion of a cat watching a dog approach its bowl. They were supposed to be your allies, yet they barred their city gates, offering only polite smiles from behind walls lined with archers. Your priest muttered that their church was heretical. Their bishop countered that you smelled like a goat pen. Both statements were technically true. Then there were the local Christians, Armenians, Syriacs, Christian Arabs, people you had been told would welcome you as liberators. Instead, they squinted at you like you were a storm cloud on the horizon. You couldn't always tell friend from foe. More than once, a group you thought was an enemy turned out to be monks. On one unfortunate occasion, you threatened a monastery and were rewarded with your tent being set on fire. And the Muslims, well, they weren't the single, united force you'd been promised in church sermons. There were Fatimids, Seljuks, and local warlords, all squabbling among themselves when they weren't squabbling with you. The result was a battlefield map that looked more like spilled ink than any kind of clear line. A man you'd been ordered to kill one week could be sitting at your campfire the next, explaining politics you didn't understand while eating your last onion. Inside your own ranks, unity was fragile at best. Bishops argued with knights, nobles argued over loot. Common soldiers formed little prayer circles or broke off entirely to follow some prophet who claimed to have seen a vision in a chicken coop. Gerald suggested settling disputes with a duel. Nobody disagreed. The only problem was deciding which quarrel to resolve first. By now, you had begun to suspect that the greatest danger of the crusade wasn't the enemy in front of you, but the people standing beside you, each convinced they were right, each ready to swing a blade over a prayer, a coin, or a loaf of bread, and the journey wasn't even half over. You dreamed of fighting alongside noble warriors, men of honor and discipline, as the church murals showed them. Instead, you found yourself in the company of the most bizarre collection of human beings you'd ever encountered outside a tavern brawl. To your left was a baker with no teeth, who'd brought a rolling pin instead of a weapon. To your right, a man named Thibaut who claimed to be a monk, but cursed like a dockworker, drank anything in a jug, and once stabbed someone over a loaf of bread. Gerald, still shirtless, had painted a cross on his chest and declared himself God's muscle. Your commander, barely 19, believed tactics meant pointing dramatically and shouting vague instructions. In one skirmish, he charged in the wrong direction and ended up in a cabbage field, insisting later that it was part of a master plan. Then there were the fanatics, men who believed God liked them so much they could not die. They marched into battle without armor, some without shoes, clutching little more than a stick and a psalm. Their survival rate was not reassuring. The merchants were worse. One sold relics out of a satchel, the thumb of St. Peter on Monday, the official Crusader toothpick on Wednesday, and what looked suspiciously like twigs every other day. And nobody could explain where the children came from, a small band of them, somehow marching with more cheer than the rest of the army combined, despite having no real purpose other than getting in the way. At night, this strange fellowship bickered, prayed, and occasionally fought over scraps of food. One man appointed himself bishop of the tents, delivering wobbly sermons from the top of a barrel until he inevitably fell off. The only thing binding this mass together was shared misery and the vague, ever-shifting goal of getting somewhere holy without dying. And then, finally, you reached a city worth taking, or at least one important enough for the commander to shout lay siege. With all the authority of someone who just invented the concept. In theory, a siege was a grand event. In practice, it was medieval camping with a higher risk of dysentery. You set up just out of arrow range, you hoped, and settled in for what could be days, weeks, or the rest of your natural life. The plan was to starve the enemy into surrender. The flaw was that you'd forgotten to bring enough food for yourselves. Someone tried to build a catapult, it collapsed before hurling anything. A battering ram was made from a felled tree and for ropes. It burned within minutes, thanks to defenders who clearly knew their business. You dug trenches, built wobbly towers, and spent a lot of time complaining. The people inside the city did not seem impressed. They stood on the walls, waving, eating olives, occasionally throwing insults and possibly waste in your direction. It rained, because of course it did, and the camp became a swamp of leaking tents, dissolving socks, and stew that tasted like betrayal. Gerald caught a rat and called it dinner. You didn't ask questions. The smell was indescribable: unwashed bodies, rotting food, and the occasional dead horse. A priest told you this was a test of faith. You suspected it was more of a biohazard. When the order to storm the walls finally came, you thought the wait was over. Ladders went up, arrows came down, and you climbed to runs before being knocked flat. The assault failed almost instantly. Everyone pretended it had been a probing of the defenses. Weeks passed, supplies dwindled, fistfights broke out over moldy bread. Someone suggested eating the mascot goat. The goat won the ensuing brawl. And then, one morning, the gates were open. Whether from starvation, sabotage, or divine intervention, you didn't know. The charge that followed was less noble procession and more a stampede of desperate lunatics with weapons and grudges. You trip on rubble before you even made it inside. Gerald disappeared with a barrel of wine and was later spotted declaring himself lord of the alleyway. The city dissolved into chaos. Looting, shouting, collapsing buildings, fires in places that had no business burning. You'd been told this was a holy war. It looked more like a holy yard sale where everything was free if you were willing to hit someone for it. In the end, the enemy was gone, the city smoldered, and the Crusaders congratulated themselves. You found a small relic, could have been a saint's bone, could have been a chicken's. Into the bag it went, but the victory felt strange. You weren't sure if you'd conquer anything at all, except perhaps your own last illusion that this war was about anything other than survival. When the dust settled and the city's ashes cooled, the war's great prize, Jerusalem or otherwise, was not a golden gate or a jeweled altar. It was the fact that you were still breathing. No minstrel had prepared you for that truth. Victory wasn't standing atop a wall with your sword raised to the sky. It was crawling into the shade with all your limbs intact and a mouthful of stale bread. The official plan was to hold the city, to make it a beacon of Christendom in the East. But nobody had truly thought through what holding the city meant. The streets still stank of smoke and blood. The wells were fouled, the walls needed repair, and the people who hadn't fled now looked at you with the kind of quiet calculation that suggested you might be next on their menu. You'd been promised glory, but what you had was a constant, grinding vigilance, watching the gates, guarding food stores, and swatting flies big enough to carry off a small child. Some men stayed behind. They had convinced themselves the hardship was worth it, or perhaps they had nothing to return to. Others set off homeward, carrying whatever they could loot, a brass candlestick here, a suspiciously ornate rug there, a bundle of dried figs that would be dust by the time they reached the next river. You chose to leave, partly because you missed your bed, and partly because you suspected another battle here would finish you. The journey back was no easier. The same roads, the same mud, the same suspicious locals who remembered you from the first march and were no happier to see you a second time. Fewer companions now, too. Some had fallen in battle, others to illness, and a few had simply vanished into foreign towns, swallowed by new lives or new graves. Gerald made it halfway to the coast before declaring himself too holy to return and settling in a tiny village where he claimed to be a prophet. You didn't argue. Weeks blurred into months. The smell of the sea was the first fresh scent you'd known in ages, and it nearly brought you to tears. A cramped ship carried you back toward your homeland. Though carried might be generous, it lurched, rolled, and leaked, leaving you green-faced and muttering prayers you hadn't uttered since you were a child. When you finally stepped back onto the muddy shore of home, the air felt different, cleaner, somehow, though that might have been your imagination. People gathered to hear your story, expecting tales of heroic charges and heavenly visions. You gave them pieces of the truth, sanded smooth and wrapped in pride. How you'd stood against the enemy, how God had spared you, how the cross on your surcoat had been seen in the holy city itself. You didn't mention the hunger, the lice, or the fact that most battles were blind chaos punctuated by screaming. In time, you would see younger men listening wide-eyed, the same way you had once listened, imagining themselves in armor and glory. You'd want to warn them, to tell them that the crusade was less about slaying infidels and more about surviving mud, disease, and the constant risk of being hit in the head by a frying pan. But you wouldn't, because in some crooked, unexplainable way, you were proud you'd gone. Not because it was holy, not because it was glorious, but because it was yours, your march, your scars, your story. And while the priests and lords would tell their version, yours would stay with you, a tale of chaos, comradeship, and the stubborn, ridiculous will to keep walking toward a city you could barely find on a map. The crusade had changed you, and that, for better or worse, was the only truth that mattered. Long before Crusaders ever dreamed of crossing continents, other warriors and athletes were shaping the foundations of combat, not with rusted swords and crooked helmets, but with discipline, training, and a deep cultural purpose. The first of these came from a land where the Nile's flood gave life to a civilization that loved order, ceremony, and, surprisingly, a good wrestling match. Ancient Egyptian wrestling wasn't the chaotic shoving you'd see outside a medieval tavern. It was technical, precise, and so valued that pharaohs themselves were depicted grappling in tomb paintings. Competitors trained for years, learning holds, throws, and locks that could unbalance an opponent in seconds. These matches were part sport, part spectacle, and part display of a man's readiness to serve the kingdom, because in Egypt, a strong body was as much a civic duty as paying taxes or building temples. The wrestlers fought barefoot on packed earth, wearing only simple loincloths, their bodies oiled to make grips harder. It wasn't a fight to the death. The Egyptians left that kind of thing to wild animals, but it was intense. Victories brought honor, favor from nobles, and sometimes even an invitation to join the elite guard. For the Egyptians, wrestling was as much about discipline and ritual as it was about strength. Across the Mediterranean, however, the Romans had a different idea of combat spectacle, one with far less soul and far more blood. Roman gladiators weren't born into glory. Most were slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals condemned to fight in the arena. But through training, charisma, and sheer survival, some became legends. The gladiatorial schools, ludi, were strict, almost monastic institutions where recruits learned weapon mastery, tactics, and how to play to the crowd. A gladiator wasn't just a killer, he was a performer. Every move had to be calculated for maximum drama. Weapons varied, the retiarius with his net and trident, dancing just out of reach. The murmillo with heavy armor and a broadsword. The secutor with a helmet so tight and smooth it looked like it had been hammered from a pot. Matches were carefully staged to test skills and entertain. Though staged in Rome didn't mean safe, wounds were real, and death was always a possibility. Gladiators who survived long enough could win their freedom, and a wooden sword, the rudis, symbolizing their release. Some chose to retire quietly, others returned to the arena for the roar of the crowd, unable to live without it. Both Egyptian wrestling and Roman gladiator combat were rooted in discipline and spectacle, but where Egypt celebrated skill and control, Rome embraced the dangerous theater of blood. In both, however, the warrior's body was the ultimate instrument, trained, tested, and displayed for the eyes of the nation. Far to the east of the Roman Empire, in the lush green lands of southern India, a martial art was being refined that blended combat with philosophy, healing, and even dance. Known as Kaleri Payadu, it is often called one of the oldest fighting systems in the world, a discipline so ancient that legends claim it was taught by the gods themselves. Training began young, often before a child was 10. The students entered the Kaleri, a sunken rectangular training ground blessed by rituals, where the earth itself was considered sacred. They moved barefoot, learning low stances that built balance and strength, strikes aimed at the body's vital points marmes, and graceful sequences that made their movements flow like water. Weapons were as much a part of Kaleri as bare hand techniques, long sticks, curved swords, flexible whips of steel called urami, that could coil like a serpent around a foe. But Kaleri wasn't purely about destruction. It was equally a healing art. Practitioners studied massage and Ayurveda, understanding the same pressure points they could harm in battle could also be used to heal. For them, combat mastery and compassion were two halves of the same path. Thousands of miles to the northeast, another legendary martial tradition was emerging, one that would become a global symbol of discipline and spiritual dedication, Shaolin Kung Fu. The Shaolin monks of China were not warriors by profession. They were spiritual men devoted to Buddhist practice. Yet, their monastery, perched in the Sanshan Mountains, was no stranger to danger. Bandits, warlords, and political upheaval often threatened their peace. Over centuries, the monks developed a martial system that fused Zen meditation with combat efficiency. Daily training was grueling, hours of stance work turned legs into pillars of stone. Conditioning drills hardened fists and shins until they could strike wood without injury. Forms Taolu imitated animals, the crane's precision, the tiger's ferocity, the snake's fluidity, each movement as much a meditation as an attack. Weapons were part of their mastery. The staff gun was their most famous, but they also trained with swords, spears, and chain whips. What set Shaolin apart wasn't just their skill, but their philosophy. Every fight was approached as a last resort, a means to protect life, not glorify violence. Both Kaleri Payatu and Shaolin Kung Fu were more than systems of combat. They were ways of life, blending the physical, mental, and spiritual into a single discipline. To master either was not merely to fight well, but to live with purpose, awareness, and respect for the power one carried. Across the seas in Japan, another warrior tradition was taking shape, one that would become as much a moral code as a martial one. The samurai were not simply soldiers, they were members of a distinct warrior class bound by a strict ethical framework known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. A samurai's training began in childhood. From the moment a boy could walk, he was taught the principles that would guide his life: loyalty to his lord, discipline in conduct, and an unshakable sense of honor. The sword was not just a weapon, it was a soul-made steel. The katana, curved and razor-sharp, became both a symbol and an extension of the samurai's spirit. But the samurai's arsenal went beyond the katana. The Yumi longbow was a primary weapon in earlier eras, its range allowing skilled archers to strike with deadly precision from horseback. Spears yari and polearms naginata gave reach and power, especially in the swirling chaos of battlefield formations. Armor was designed for both protection and mobility. Lacquered plates bound with silk cords, lighter than the heavy steel of Europe, allowing swift movement in combat. What set the samurai apart, however, was not just their skill with weapons, but their unyielding adherence to Bushido. Honor was absolute. To fail one's duty was the greatest shame, and many chose ritual suicide seppuku over living with dishonor. Courage, benevolence, respect, and sincerity were not mere virtues, but obligations. The battlefield was where these ideals were tested, but the true measure of a samurai lay in how he lived when the war ended. While outsiders often see only the image of the lone swordsman, the reality was more complex. Samurai served as administrators, poets, and scholars as much as warriors. Many studied calligraphy, tea ceremony, and Zen meditation, believing that mastery of the self was as important as mastery of the sword. In the quiet between battles, a samurai might spend as much time perfecting a poem about falling cherry blossoms as he did practicing his cuts. The two acts, to him, were not opposites but complements. Both required awareness, precision, and the acceptance that all things, like the blossoms, must fall. The samurai's legacy would last far beyond their era, shaping Japanese culture and influencing martial traditions across the world. In their world, as in that of the Crusader, the soldier's life was hard, dangerous, and often short. But unlike the chaotic holy wars of Europe, the samurai's path was lit by a clear and unwavering code, one that demanded that every strike, every word, and every breath be worthy of the name they carried. If the samurai's world was bound by the strict etiquette of the sword, the Mongol warrior's life was shaped by the endless horizon of the steppe. Born in the harsh climates of Central Asia, the Mongol horsemen were not simply soldiers, they were a people forged entirely for war, mobility, and survival. A Mongol child learned to ride before he could walk steadily. By the age of 5, he could control a pony, a full gallop. By 10, he was practicing with the short, powerful composite bow, a weapon made from wood, horn, and sinew that could send an arrow clean through armor. The bow's curve and size made it perfect for shooting from horseback, even while turning in the saddle. This skill, known as the Parthian shot, allowed Mongols to rain arrows on a pursuing enemy or retreating at full speed. Their horses were small, but unbelievably hardy, able to survive on scrub grass and endure long days without water. Every warrior kept several mounts, switching between them mid-ride to maintain speed for days on end. On campaign, Mongol forces could cover 100 miles in a single day, a pace that left slower armies bewildered and exhausted. Their warfare was not about direct, brutal charges like those of the European knights. It was about precision, deception, and relentless pressure. Feigned retreats lured enemies into traps. Small, fast units could appear from nowhere, strike, and vanish into the horizon. Communication was rapid and coordinated through a system of flags, horns, and messengers. Under Genghis Khan, this became a war machine that could dismantle empires. Discipline was absolute. Looting without permission was punishable by death, and orders were followed without hesitation. Yet, Mongol strategy was flexible. If a method worked, they used it. Whether it came from China, Persia, or the Middle East, siege warfare, once foreign to steppe tribes, became part of their arsenal after capturing engineers from conquered lands. Soon, they could break fortified cities with catapults, gunpowder bombs, and psychological warfare. Life off the battlefield was equally mobile. A Mongol camp, the Ordo, could be packed up and moved in hours. Families traveled with the army, herding animals and setting out felt yurts that kept out the cold mines. The line between soldier and civilian blurred. In truth, every Mongol was part of the war effort. Wherever they rode, fear preceded them, tales of unstoppable horsemen who came like a storm cloud spread across Europe and Asia. To their enemies, they were destruction incarnate. To their own people, they were protectors, providers, and the living embodiment of state pride. Unlike the Crusaders or the samurai, the Mongols had no sacred city to defend, no singular code of honor to uphold. Their loyalty was to the Khan and to each other, and that unity, combined with unmatched mobility, made them one of the most feared and effective military forces in history. In the rolling hills and open grasslands of southern Africa, a new kind of army rose in the early 19th century, one that would redefine tribal warfare on the continent. Under the leadership of Shaka Zulu, the Impi transformed from loosely organized warrior bands into a disciplined, lethal force capable of overwhelming enemies through speed, precision, and ruthless efficiency. Before Shaka's rise, Zulu warriors fought with long-throwing spears, assegai, and light shields, engaging in skirmishes that often ended without decisive victories. Shaka changed everything. He introduced the iklewa, a short stabbing spear with a broad blade, designed for brutal, close-quarters combat. Warriors no longer stood at a distance exchanging spears. They closed in, shield to shield, and fought until the enemy line broke. The Zulu shield isalongu, made from cowhide and nearly as tall as a man, was both protection and weapon. Warriors used it to hook an opponent's shield aside, opening them to a killing thrust. Training drills were relentless, long runs, formation practice, and mock battles until the movements became instinct. Shaka's most famous innovation was his battlefield formation. The horns of the buffalo, the strongest regiments, formed the chest, engaging the enemy head-on. The horns, fast-moving flanking units, swept around to encircle the foe, while the loins waited in reserve to reinforce or exploit breakthroughs. It was a strategy designed not just to win, but to annihilate. Discipline within the Impi was strict. Warriors served in age-based regiments amabutho, lived together in military kraals, and were forbidden to marry until they had proven themselves in battle. Loyalty to the king was absolute, and disobedience was punished swiftly. Campaigns were lightning fast, with warriors covering vast distances barefoot, carrying only air weapons and a few days' provisions. The psychological impact of the Zulu army was as powerful as their tactics. Enemy tribes, unprepared for the speed and ferocity of the Impi, often broke before contact. Even European colonial forces, armed with firearms, found themselves hard-pressed against the sheer aggression of a Zulu charge, as famously seen at the Battle of Isimlawana in 1879, where the Impi inflicted one of the British Empire's worst defeats. For the Zulu, war was not just about territory. It was about identity, honor, and the forging of unity under a single ruler. The Impi was the beating heart of the kingdom, a force feared across the region, its warriors bound together by tradition, discipline, and the will of their king. They were not crusaders chasing a holy vision, nor samurai bound by poetry and code. They were the living embodiment of war itself, swift, relentless, and impossible to ignore. From the cold, wine-lashed coasts of Scandinavia came a people whose name alone could freeze the blood of medieval Europe, the Vikings. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, they sailed from their fjords in sleek, shallow-drafted longships, carrying axes, swords, and a reputation for fire and plunder. The Viking warrior was as much a sailor as a fighter. Life in the Norse bred resilience, long winters, meager harvests, and a need to take what the land could not provide. Bows learned to row before they could read, to navigate by the stars and the shape of the coastline. By the time they joined a raiding party, they could handle an oar for days without rest and fight with the same endurance on land. Their weapons were practical and brutally efficient. The axe was the most iconic, light enough to swing quickly, heavy enough to split shield or skull. Swords were prized, often passed down through generations, their blades decorated with intricate patterns. Spears, bows, and round wooden shields painted with bold designs completed the arsenal. Armor was rare for common warriors, usually just a helmet and a thick wool tunic, but the wealthier wore chainmail looted or traded from abroad. The longship was the heart of Viking power. Its design allowed for swift travel over open seas and silent approach up shallow rivers. Villages that thought themselves safe inland often woke to find Viking sails on the horizon. Raids were swift, brutal, and calculated. Strike at dawn, take valuables and captives, burn what remained, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. But the Vikings were not merely berserkers and pirates. They were also traders, settlers, and explorers. Their raids on monasteries in England and Ireland were infamous, but so were their voyages to distant lands, Iceland, Greenland, and even Vinland, North America. They founded towns like Dublin and shaped the political map of Britain, France, and Russia. Battle tactics varied. In small-scale raids, shock and speed were enough. In larger wars, they formed tight shield walls, locking shields together and advancing like a living wall of wood and steel. Within the shield wall, warriors thrust with spears and hacked with axes, stepping forward over the fallen as the line pressed on. The Viking spirit was fueled by a worldview steeped in Norse mythology. Death in battle was not an end to be feared but a gateway to Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where fallen warriors feasted and fought until the end of days. This belief made them fearless, and to their enemies, terrifying. Where the Crusaders marched for holy cause, the samurai for honor, and the Mongols for empire, the Vikings came for something simpler: wealth, glory, and the songs that would be sung of them long after the smoke of their raids faded over the horizon. When most people imagine the Middle Ages, they see the knight, armored in gleaming steel, mounted on a war horse, and bound by the lofty ideals of chivalry. But the reality, as always, was more complicated. The path to knighthood began in boyhood. A noble-born child would first serve as a page, learning courtly manners, horsemanship, and the basics of weapon handling. By adolescence, he became a squire, directly serving a knight, carrying his armor, tending his horse, and training in the arts of war. Only after proving himself in battle or through years of service would he be dubbed a knight, kneeling before a lord to receive the ceremonial blow on the shoulder. Knights were the elite heavy cavalry of Europe. Clad in chain mail in earlier centuries and later in full plate armor, they were nearly invulnerable to most weapons of the time. Their primary weapon was the lance for mounted charges, followed by the sword, mace, or warhammer for close combat. The destrier, a powerful war horse, was as much a weapon as the knight himself, capable of smashing into enemy lines with tremendous force. The code of chivalry was an idealized set of virtues: loyalty to one's lord, protection of the weak, courage in battle, and devotion to God. In practice, knights could be as brutal and self-serving as any other soldier, but the code provided a cultural ideal to aspire to, and a powerful tool for propaganda. On the battlefield, knights were devastating in a direct charge. A line of armored cavalry thundering toward enemy ranks could break infantry formations through sheer impact. But their strength was also a weakness. They were less effective in rough terrain, vulnerable to disciplined pike formations, and dependent on expensive equipment and support. When not at war, knights often competed in tournaments, part training exercise, part social spectacle. Events like the joust allowed them to hone their skills, display their prowess, and win fame or a wealthy bride. Outside the lists, some served as household guards for kings or as enforcers for feudal lords, while others joined military orders like the Templars or Hospitallers, blending the knightly role with religious vows. Knighthood carried a certain cultural weight. The sight of a knight's banner on the horizon could rally allies or terrify enemies. Yet, for all their power, knights were not invincible. The rise of professional infantry, longbows, and eventually gunpowder would erode their dominance. Battles like Agincourt proved that even the most gallant knight could fall to a peasant with a well-placed arrow. Still, in the medieval imagination, the knight remained the shining figure, a symbol of order amid chaos, of noble duty amid the blood and mud of war. Whether they lived up to that symbol was another matter entirely. In the heart of the Ottoman Empire, an elite corps emerged that would dominate battlefields for centuries: the Janissaries Yenicheri, the Sultan's household troops and one of the first standing armies in Europe since the Roman legions. Their rise was as much about politics and loyalty as it was about military skill. The Janissary system was built on the devvirm, a levy on Christian populations in the Balkans and other conquered territories. Young bows, often between 8 and 18, were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained to serve the empire. This practice was brutal in its uprooting, but it also offered those bows a path to wealth, power, and prestige unavailable in their original villages. Once in the corps, the training was rigorous. Janissaries were drilled in discipline, marksmanship, and close combat. They learned to fight in tight formations, to march for days, and to adapt to any battlefield. Uniquely for the time, they became experts with firearms, adopting matchlock muskets in the 15th century, long before many European armies fully embraced gunpowder weapons. Their trademark uniform, tall, white felt hats with a long flap at the back, made them instantly recognizable, and their discipline on the field was legendary. In siege warfare, they were often the first to storm the breach, while in open battle they anchored the Ottoman lines, unleashing devastating volleys of gunfire before advancing with sabers and spears. But the Janissaries were more than just soldiers, they were a political force. Answering directly to the Sultan, they acted as his personal guard and enforcers, and over time their influence grew. By the 17th century, they had a say in court politics, could depose sultans, and even sparked rebellions when their privileges were threatened. This political power was a double-edged sword. Once known for their discipline and strict celibacy, later generations became comfortable, even corrupt, resisting modernization and reform. By the 19th century, the course had become a barrier to change, clinging to outdated methods, while the rest of the world's armies advanced. The end came in 1826, during the auspicious incident when Sultan Mahmud II, determined to modernize the army, turned his artillery on the Janissary barracks in Istanbul. Thousands were killed or exiled, and the once feared corps was wiped from history. In their prime, however, the Janissaries were unmatched, a blend of loyalty, innovation, and relentless training that allowed the Ottoman Empire to stretch from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. Where knights embodied chivalry and the Vikings embodied freedom, the Janissaries embodied the absolute power of a centralized state. High in the rugged hills of Nepal, a small, fierce people have built a reputation that far exceeds their numbers. The Gurkhas, renowned for their loyalty, toughness, and fearlessness, have fought in some of the most difficult terrains and brutal wars of the modern era. Their motto, "Better to die than be a coward," is no empty phrase. The Gurkha story as a modern fighting force began in the early 19th century, during the Anglo-Nepalese War 1814–1816. The British East India Company expected an easy victory over the hill tribes, but instead met an enemy that fought with cunning, stamina, and terrifying close-quarter ferocity. Though outnumbered and outgunned, the Gurkhas held their mountain forts for months, forcing the British to negotiate. Impressed by their skill and courage, the British began recruiting them into their own army, a tradition that continues to this day. Central to the Gurkha identity is the kukuri, a forward-curving knife that serves as both weapon and tool. In battle, it is used with devastating efficiency. In daily life, it chops wood, clears brush, and butchers livestock. Every Gurkha soldier learns to wield it with precision, and stories, some true, some exaggerated, tell of enemies falling with a single blow. Gurkha training emphasizes endurance. Recruits are chosen through some of the most grueling selection processes in the world, including the famous Doko race, where candidates run uphill for miles carrying a wicker basket loaded with rocks. Once in service, they adapt to all conditions, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the jungles of Burma and the deserts of North Africa. Their reputation was cemented in World War I and World War II, where they fought in nearly every major theater. Allied troops who served alongside them spoke of their discipline, quiet humor, and unshakable bravery. Enemies often feared them before a shot was fired, knowing the Gurkhas would keep coming until the fight was over, and sometimes beyond. Yet for all their ferocity in combat, Gurkhas are known off the battlefield for humility and kindness. They are as quick to offer help to a stranger as they are to face danger without hesitation. For them, military service is not just a profession, but a calling, a continuation of centuries-old traditions of loyalty to their leaders and community. Today, Gurkhas serve not only in the British and Indian armies, but also in peacekeeping missions around the world. They remain living proof that skill, courage, and spirit can outweigh numbers and technology. Where the Vikings had their lawnships, the samurai their code, and the Janissaries their muskets, the Gurkhas have the quiet certainty of men who know exactly who they are, and the steel curve of the kukuri, ready in their hands. Far across the seas in Aotearoa, the land we now call New Zealand, the Mbori people developed a warrior culture as fierce as it was deeply rooted in tradition, ancestry, and spiritual belief. To the Mbori, warfare was not simply about land or resources. It was a matter of mana, prestige, honor, and the spiritual authority of the tribe Iwai. Mbori warriors trained from youth, learning to move silently through dense forests, to read the land and the sea, and to fight with an array of distinctive weapons. Chief among these was the taiaha, a long wooden staff with a pointed spear tip at one end, and a flat striking blade at the other. Mastery of the taiaha was as much an art as a skill, involving swift footwork, feints, and precise strikes. Other weapons included the mir, a short club carved from greenstone pounamu, capable of delivering a lethal blow. Before battle, Mbori warriors would perform the haka, a fierce war dance combining foot stamping, chest slapping, tongue protrusions, and shouted chants. To outsiders, it looked terrifying. To the Mbori, it was a sacred ritual to summon courage, unify the warriors, and call upon the spirits of their ancestors. The haka was not mere theater. It was a psychological weapon designed to unnerve the enemy before the first blow was struck. Mbori warfare relied heavily on cunning strategy. Tribes built fortified villages with ingenious defenses, layered palisades, ditches, and elevated fighting stages from which defenders could hurl spears or stones. Raiding parties moved swiftly in canoes waka, navigating rivers and coastlines to launch surprise attacks. Ambushes, night raids, and quick retreats were common tactics. The arrival of European muskets in the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought dramatic changes. The so-called musket wars saw inter-tribal conflicts escalate as firearms replaced traditional weapons, though even then, Mbori adapted quickly, incorporating muskets into their tactics while still honoring their warrior customs. To this day, the warrior spirit remains a proud part of Mbori identity. The haka is still performed, not for war, but at cultural gatherings, sports events, and ceremonies, carrying the same fierce energy and connection to heritage. Where the Gurkhas embody humble bravery and the Vikings embodied fearless exploration, the Mbori warrior stood as both a protector of his people and a living link to the ancestors, fighting not just for survival, but for the mana of his tribe and the honor of his lineage. In the arid deserts and rugged mountains of what is now the southwestern United States and northern Mexico, the Apache people forged a warrior tradition built on speed, stealth, and an intimate knowledge of the land. For centuries, they resisted incursions from Spanish, Mexican, and later American forces, becoming legends of guerrilla warfare. Apache bows grew up learning to ride bareback, track animals, and survive with minimal resources. By adolescence, they could read the faintest signs in the dust, a broken twig, a displaced stone, and follow them for miles. This mastery of terrain was their greatest weapon. An Apache war party could vanish into the wilderness after a raid, leaving no trail an enemy could follow. Their weapons evolved over time. Before European contact, the bow and arrow, spear, and stone-headed clubs were common. With the arrival of horses in the 17th century, the Apache became skilled like cavalry, able to cover vast distances quickly. By the 19th century, they had incorporated rifles and revolvers into their arsenal, but their tactics remained rooted in mobility and surprise. Apache warfare was often defensive, protecting territory, resources, and family from encroachment. But when they went on the offensive, they struck hard and fast. Small war bands launched hit-and-run raids on enemy settlements, ambushed military patrols, and destroyed supply lines. They fought in loose formations, using the landscape to mask their movements and confuse larger, slower armies. The Apache fought not as an empire or a centralized state, but as a network of tribes and bands, each with its own leaders. Figures like Geronimo, Cochise, and Victoria became legendary for their ability to evade capture and lead their people through years of relentless pursuit by much larger forces. Psychological warfare played its part, too. The sudden whoops of an Apache charge in the dark could terrify opponents into retreat. Their uncanny ability to disappear, riding into the mountains one moment, seemingly melting into the rocks the next, added to the aura of invincibility. Despite their skill, the Apache faced overwhelming odds as industrial powers pushed into their lands. The late 19th century saw the last of the Apache resistance crushed, with Geronimo's surrender in 1886 marking the symbolic end of their long struggle. Yet the Apache warrior legacy lives on. In the pride of their descendants, in military units like the U.S. Army's Apache helicopters named in their honor, and in the enduring lessons of guerrilla warfare they perfected, where the Mbori harnessed the haka to unite and intimidate, and the Zulu mastered the horns of the buffalo to envelop their enemies, the Apache turned the land itself into their ally, proving that speed, cunning, and knowledge could level the field against any foe. In the rugged hills of ancient Greece, in a small but fiercely independent city-state called Sparta, bows were not raised to be farmers or traders, they were forged to be warriors. The Spartan hoplite was the very embodiment of discipline and unity, his life dedicated entirely to the defense and glory of his polis. From the age of 7, Spartan boys entered the Agi, a brutal state-run training system. They were taught endurance through hardship, cunning through deprivation, and loyalty through constant competition. Softness was weeded out early, clothing was minimal, food was scarce, and punishments for failure were harsh. They learned to move silently, speak little, and fight without hesitation. Van Benem-CC Hunt hoplite's primary weapon was the dory, a spear roughly 2.5 meters long, designed for thrusting from behind the safety of the aspis, a large, round shield made of wood and bronze. In close quarters, they carried a short sword ziphos for when the spear was lost or broken. Armor was heavy, a bronze helmet, cuirass, and greaves covering the shins, giving each warrior the look of a walking statue. That the true power of the Spartan army lay not in individual heroics, but in the phalanx formation, a wall of overlapping shields and projecting spears that advanced as one. In the phalanx, the man beside you was as important as the weapon in your hand. Discipline held the line. If one man broke, the formation collapsed. Spartans fought not for personal gain but for the survival of their city. Their society was built on the idea that every citizen warrior was a cog in the machine of state defense. To flee from battle was unthinkable, as their mothers reportedly told them before war, return with your shield, or on it. The most famous test of Spartan valor came in for 80 BC at Thermopylae, when King Leonidas and 300 Spartans, alongside a few thousand allies, held a narrow pass against the massive Persian army of Xerxes. Though they were eventually overwhelmed, their stand became a symbol of courage and sacrifice against impossible odds. Spartan dominance lasted for centuries, but like all warrior societies, it eventually declined. Changing tactics, new weapons, and political shifts eroded their supremacy, and by the time of Alexander the Great, Sparta's role was diminished. Still, their legacy endured. The discipline of the phalanx would echo in armies for millennia, and the very word Spartan became shorthand for toughness, simplicity, and unwavering resolve. Where the Apache mastered the art of disappearing into the land, and the Mongols ruled by speed and range, the Spartans proved that unity, discipline, and the will to stand shoulder to shoulder could turn a small city into one of the most feared military powers of the ancient world. Long before the Crusaders rode under the cross, the Roman legions marched under the eagle. For over 5 centuries, these disciplined, professional soldiers were the steel spine of an empire that stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the windswept moors of Britain. A Roman legionary was not a part-time fighter. He was a career soldier, often serving for 20 to 25 years. Recruits trained relentlessly, marching 20 miles in full gear, digging fortified camps, and drilling combat maneuvers until they became second nature. Roman discipline was legendary. Disobedience could mean flogging, execution, or decimation, the execution of every 10th man in a unit to punish collective failure. The legionaries' equipment was as practical as it was deadly. The short stabbing sword, the gladius, was designed for use in tight formation, where slashing was less effective than quick thrusts into an exposed enemy. The scutum, a large rectangular shield, provided excellent protection and was a crucial part of the testudo tortoise formation, in which shields locked together overhead and in front to form an almost impenetrable shell. Armor varied over time, from chainmail larica hamata to the segmented plate larica segmentata, but it was always designed to balance protection with mobility. Javelins pila were used before closing in, their soft iron tips bending on impact to prevent the enemy from throwing them back. The legion's real strength, however, was its organization. Each legion was divided into cohorts, centuries, and contubernia squads of 8 men who lived and fought together. Clear chains of command, standardized training, and detailed logistics meant that Rome could deploy and sustain armies far from home for years at a time. In battle, Roman tactics were flexible. They could form tight defensive lines, absorb a charge, and counterattack in perfect unison. In sieges, their engineers built siege towers, battering rams, and intricate fortifications. On campaign, they constructed roads and bridges at remarkable speed, ensuring that supply lines were never broken. The legion was more than just a military unit, it was a tool of empire. After conquest, legionaries often became settlers, founding colonies that spread Roman culture, law, and language deep into conquered lands. This blending of soldier and colonist helped Rome maintain control over vast territories. But no army is invincible. Over time, political instability, overextension, and reliance on foreign mercenaries weakened the legions. By the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, the once unbreakable formations had given way to fractured, desperate forces fighting more for survival than for glory. Even so, the legacy of the Roman legion endures in modern military organization, engineering, and strategy. Where the Spartans taught the value of unyielding defense, the Romans mastered the art of disciplined defense, an army not of lone heroes, but of men moving as one, building an empire with their shields locked and their eagles held high.